What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to take a look at how you can really easily add infinite scroll into your applications. So whether you're working with a table view or collection view, scroll to the bottom, load more data, and show like a nice spinner at the bottom. So we are going to use a package to do this. I've got a dedicated video teaching you how to do this manually, but this package I came across is pretty nifty. Before we jump into things, start by dropping a like down below, hit subscribe if you're new here. Let's open up Xcode, create a new project, and get into the weeds of things. So we're going to stick with the app template under iOS, and let me go ahead and call this application name My Books. We're going to create a table view with a bunch of book names on it. And we're going to work with Storyboard and Swift today. This works with Swift UI as well as Objective-C. Go ahead and toss your project wherever you'd like. I'll throw it onto my desktop. And first things first, we are going to full screen Xcode here. And I'll also go ahead and build and run into a simulator just to make sure that it is indeed working. So there is our simulator. Let that load right over there. Alright, so the first thing we want to do in our project is bring in the package. I'm going to bring it in via Swift Package Manager. So we'll go to File, Add Package. I'll paste in the URL for the repo, which I've copied already. It looks like our app has launched. And I'll go ahead and actually install it. So it's called UI Scroll View, Infinite Scroll. Collection views and both table views inherit from UI Scroll View, which is why it's named UI Scroll View. So once you bring it on in, we're just going to jump into the view controller and write our code inside of here. But of course, we want to actually import the package, which is UI scroll view _ infinite scroll. So cool, let's make sure our application is open. It indeed is, and let's go ahead and jump into things. So the general premise of this type of user interface is you have some data. Once you scroll to the bottom, you want to detect that you're at the bottom, shown like a nice spinner activity indicator. Do some networking usually, either get more posts from an API or read it from core data, wherever those posts are. And you want to seamlessly add those, cells and not change the user's position in the scroll. So it's not like you want to add, 10 more posts and then pop them to the top, because that would be annoying. So let's go ahead and jot some notes down. So we want to set up table view. We're going to say set up table, set up scroll handling, and then add cells. So let's go ahead and do this one by one. So the first we're going to do is just create a pretty basic table view. And here we're going to say private let table is going to be a UI table view. And we're going to create this with a anonymous closure like so. This will be a UI table view. We'll return it here. I'm going to register a base class cell to this since we don't really want to customize cells in today's video. If you're not familiar with table views, I have a ridiculous number of videos already dedicated to just table views. So go ahead and take a look at that if you want to get up to speed with the basics. So we're going to add this as a subview, set up its delegate and its data source, as well as lay this guy out. So I'll just activate some constraints, which will be a collection of constraints. And I'm going through this a little quickly because I want to get to the good stuff, which is the infinite scroll. So bear with me while I copy and paste all this stuff super duper quick. And hopefully I don't make a mistake here while I do this. Alrighty, left will be left and right anchor will be right anchor. So cool, so this is going to yell at me if I try to build right now because we have not conformed to the respective protocols. So we'll need to bring those in up here for the table view delegate as well as the table view data source. And we want to implement the minimum functions down here, which is number of rows. And we'll return 10 for the time being before we improve this a little bit. And cell for row at index path, in which we will dequeue a cell by simply saying table view dequeue reusable cell with a particular identifier and add an index path. And I'll just return the cell here and assign the text on the text label. So we want text label.text will be hello world. So let's go ahead and give that a build and run. I know I went through it pretty quick, but we should have a table showing up here like so. So awesome. So what we actually are going to do is instead of just have these cells being added manually, I am going to create a mock API service. And the reason I'm going to do this is so we can actually simulate loading more posts at the bottom of the table once we scroll down there. So let's create a new file. It'll be a Swift file, and I'm going to call it API caller. And all I'm going to do is just hard code return some data in here with a delay. And the reason we're going to add a delay is just to simulate a network call. So we are going to say static like shared API caller. So this guy will be in fact a singleton. And let's go ahead and say that we have some models in here, which will be an array of strings. And we will go ahead and say there will be one function that says fetch data. And fetching data is going to have a completion, which will be escaping, returning a collection of strings and returning void. Collection of strings will be the parameter to our closure here. And we could use Swift concurrency, but we won't today. So let's see why this is yelling at me. All right, that error has gone away. And what I'll go ahead and do is say dispatch queue global. All right, and we can say async. Let's do async after, and we're gonna say now plus 2 seconds. We wanna execute something, and what we're gonna basically execute is we're just gonna create some models and stick it in there. So what I'll go ahead and say self.models will be, let's see, an array of 0 or 1 through, let's do 20. And I will actually go ahead and map these to a string. So we did say we are making a book app, so we'll say book, and then we'll just stick the number in there like so. And we don't want to cause a memory leak, so I will capture self with a weak pointer like so, and we want to update this guy right here. And respectively, what we can do is we can just simply call the completion handler, and we can say self.models, and because that is optional, I will go ahead and provide a default of an empty collection like so. Now keep in mind that this is explicitly being done on a background queue, so we will want to handle sending this back to the main queue when we want to update our UI. And let me just shorthand this a little bit. Alrighty, and I'll copy and paste this to the right below it, actually, next function, and this is going to be load more posts. Now what we are actually going to do is something a little cool. So instead of just adding 1 to 20 more, we're going to get the last thing and just append the last number. So what I'll go ahead and do is we are going to say guard let strong self will be self, else we'll just return here so we don't have to deal with the unwrapping of the optional. And we are going to say that the last element, I'll go ahead and say last, will be strong self dot models dot last. And once we know we have this, we want to get the number out. So we are saying here book space and then the number. So I'll pop off the numbers. I'm going to go ahead and say the number is going to be the last. And we are going to split the components by a space. So we want components separated by space and the last thing in here, and we know it's going to exist, so I'll just force unwrap it, and we're going to cast this guy to an integer. Now this number will be the lower bound of what we add, so here we can go ahead and say number plus 1, and here we're going to go ahead and say, let me actually clean this up, so I'll go ahead and call this start, and we'll add an end here, so we'll say start, end. And here we'll go ahead and say start will be number plus 1, and end will be start plus 20. So let's go ahead and see if this wants to cooperate. We want this to be end. Let me go ahead and try that once more, and it looks like this is still yelling at me. So I believe number will be optional because we are trying to cast it. So I'll go ahead and force unwrap that as well. If it crashes, we'll take a look at it. So essentially what we're doing is we're getting the last thing in our models. We're just gonna be updating our models with it, but instead of reassigning, what we want to do is we actually want to append. So we're gonna say strong self dot model, and then we're gonna say append contents of, and we're gonna create this new collection here. So bear with me. So we'll say new data will be this guy, and then I'll append the contents of new data, and then finally pass it back via our callback. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I'll run through this in a moment once we see everything working. Back in our view controller, instead of hard coding the number of models here, let's go ahead and bring in that service. So we're going to go ahead and say let service will be API caller dot shared. And then what we are going to do is, let's go ahead and actually jump into this. Now we have models that we've privatized. Let's make this public. but private set, so it can only be assigned to in here. And what I will go ahead and do is we are going to use this in our view controller here. So in number of rows, we are going to say service.models.count, and then here we can do basically a similar thing and get the current model by saying service.models. We want to get the thing at the particular index path.row. And now that we've got this, we can simply assign it to our text. So let's go ahead and actually load our first batch of data. So here we are going to say service, and we have two functions on here, fetch data and load more data. So fetch data, and we are going to get posts back. And essentially, we don't actually even need this because we are accessing the models from the service. So inside of here, we can go ahead and say dispatch queue, main, async, we can say self, table view, reload data, self table I should say, reload data. Once again, we don't want to leak any memory, so we are going to capture weak self like so. Go ahead and build and run, and we should see some data pop up in 2 seconds since we have that delay set. So cool, we do. We see book 1, and we can scroll down and we see book 20. Obviously no infinite scroll yet. So the magic of that is actually part of this framework. Let me just go ahead and clean this up a little bit. So the first thing we want to do up here is set up table. So I'll abstract this to its own function. We'll privatize it. So we'll say setup table, pop that in there. Let's see what's wrong here. It is complaining at me because I forgot the func keyword, which is slightly important. And then here we are fetching data. We'll say set up data bindings. So essentially fetching data as well as loading more data we'll do in this function. So we'll say set up data bindings. And the way that we actually do this is we can say on the table, we can set up an infinite scroll handler. So there's an infinite scroll direction. You can see that there are quite a few functions and functionality that the package does indeed add. So you can set up the particular view that you want to show. You can set up the direction. I believe it is vertical by default, but I digress. Let's go ahead and set up the handler. And what we want to do is we can say add infinite scroll handler like this. What we get in the closure is the table view itself. We want to do something, and then we want to say table finish infinite scroll, essentially telling our function here that we are done with the loading of new data, as well as we are done updating the UI. So this will be finish like so. We first want to fetch more data, and then we also want to add cells accordingly. So cool, let's go ahead and give this a run. Let's see what happens if we scroll down. So we're gonna scroll down, and we see that we actually already have the spinner down here already good to go. It's loading apparently something. Now we already called finish here, which is why it goes away. So if I comment this out and give this a run, you'll see that this actually will stick around. So we'll come down here and the spinner will stick around. It's a little generic. You can play with the view here and make it look nicer like some other apps do, but you know, that's all customization. So let's fetch more data. So we're gonna go ahead and say self.service. And once again, we don't wanna leak memory. So we are going to say self-optional.service, and we're gonna say load more posts. And in this case, we do get a collection of more posts. So let's go ahead and shorthand this since we know we can indeed do that. And here we are going to once again say weak self, and here we'll say more data like so. And what we actually want to do inside of here is go and update our table view as well as its cells. So we know that by doing this, the underlying models property inside the service is being updated. So we have two options in here. So let's try option number 1 and see what actually happens. We can say self table, go ahead and reload yourself. So let's go ahead and see if this actually does anything appropriate. Now we're going to do this on the main queue since it is a UI operation. And let me actually get rid of these comments here. And once we do that, we'll call the finish API in here since all this work is async. And let's see what we actually get happening in practice. there is a caveat here with collection views that I will touch on in a moment. So we'll call that API. We should get more data. Okay, we do. We see 21. We can continue scrolling. And what's nice with the collection view, or the table view, I should say, is you'll notice that we actually kept the spot we were at. So we're at book 41. And when we called reload data, the UI table view that is backing this actually did not change the offset. This is not the case with collection views. With collection views, when you call reload data, it'll actually pop you to the top of the actual view. So what you want to do instead is, with the collection view, there's an API called perform batch updates where you can actually add the cells manually. Now you can actually also do that here with the table view as well. So we can say table, and then you can actually say, hey, insert rows and provide a collection of index paths. And let's go ahead and actually do this. So here we can specify an automation. We'll say it'll be the automatic automation, or animation, I should say. And the way that we get these index paths is essentially by getting the number out of the more data up here. So what I'll go ahead and do is, let me just get the number out. So we'll say start index will be more data dot first dot components. Let me force unwrap this. And we want to, once again, do components separated by space. And then from this, we'll get the last thing, which will be the number. And then finally, I will cast this to be an integer like so. Force unwrap that as well. So this will be this. We'll stick that in there for a second so it doesn't yell at me. And what we know is we want to create from start index, and I believe it'll be start index -1 because the cells go from 0 and we actually start books at 1. So what we do know is here we can say that the start will be start index -1 and the end will be start plus more data.count. So hopefully my math is correct here. And the last thing we want to do is actually create index paths. So we'll say indices will be an array from start through end inclusive, and we're going to compact map this, and I'll return an index path where this will be the row. So we're going to say the row is $0 and the section will just be 0. So I'll explain this in a moment, assuming my math is correct. And we'll toss that right there. I believe start to end is correct. I believe this needs to be exclusive of the end index. So let me scroll down and see what happens. If my math is wrong, we'll crash and it will yell at me that things are out of bound, which in fact it did. So let's see what the error is. I'll debug this live and in action. So see internal inconsistency, invalid update. Let's see, invalid number of rows and sections, 0 the number of rows contains in an existing section. So let's see what happened here. So this is inserting rows at particular indices. Let me go ahead and just print out start and end. And if my math is super wrong, I'll just cut the video since this is a little out of scope. But we will go ahead and scroll down and we should see those indices pop up here as well as a crash. So we're saying this is from 0 to 41, which is totally not correct. So let's see why we're getting 0 for the start. So we're saying start index is more data dot first. And in fact, this should be correct because this is loading more posts. And let's see why that is. We're saying split by components and get the last. So let me actually print out more data. And I always love including these debugging type parts into the video because it kind of shows a realistic view of things, of how 99% of people don't write correct code the first time around. So I never want to make that misleading. So here we have book 1, 2 in more data. I see. The reason we're doing this, we're getting book 1, 2, and all of this jazz here is because in our callback of our API caller, we're passing back the entire collection. So when we say load more data, instead of just passing the new data back, we're passing everything back. So we can actually get rid of this, and we can actually also get rid of this in the callback here. We don't actually need to pass the data back at all since we read it from the models. And if we jump back to our view controller, We're not using this, we can get rid of that. And now our more data should only be the additional additive data that we get back from our API, well, our mock API in this case. So we'll come and look at this, and it looks like no crash here, so we should see more data. This is the data that we get, and if we scroll down, we now see book 20, 21, and I think this should go to 41, which it in fact does. Boom, look at that. So the point I wanted to illustrate here is that you don't have to do reload data because it is a more expensive operation to reload all the data, even though the table view does take care of, the visible cells only on screen. But I digress. This is getting into the weeds of performance optimizations. This package is really cool. I'll leave a link to it down in the description below. I appreciate you guys watching as always. If you haven't dropped a like yet and you stuck around all the way to the end, super appreciate you. Don't forget to do so. Leave a comment for the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe if you're new. If you know other iOS devs and haven't shared their channel, make sure to do so. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.